Hello, my name is Debbie Doyle. I'm the meetings manager here at the American Historical Association. Thank you for attending the American Historical Review conversation on Black internationalism, which is part of the AHA Colloquium series of virtual AHA. We're excited to have you join us and are looking forward to a productive discussion. I would like to thank our generous sponsors, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Stanton Foundation, the History Channel, and Oxford University Press. You can support virtual AHA and other AHA activities by joining the AHA, or if you're already a member, making a donation today. We'll post links with details in the chat at the end of our conversation today. A few logistical things to cover before we start the webinar. By registering for or participating in the AHA's webinars, participants and panelists agree to abide by our code of professional conduct. Please use the Q&A function to submit questions to the presenters. We hope to address all relevant questions, but need to be mindful of the time, so we may paraphrase or combine questions. If you'd like to be part of the conversation on social media, remember to use the virtual AHA hashtag. Finally, a quick reminder that this webinar is being recorded and we will share the recording on YouTube. I'll now turn things over to Michelle Moyd of Indiana University, who is the chair of today's session. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you all for being here today. I'm Michelle Moyd, as she mentioned. I'm the former associate editor of the American Historical Review, and I'm also an associate professor of history at Indiana University. And I'd like to really welcome you all to this roundtable, which is dedicated to the recent American Historical Review, the most recent conversation that was published by the American Historical Review. The conversation appeared in the December 2020 issue, which featured the topic Black internationalism as the feature, the topic of the conversation. Inspired by the current vibrancy and visibility of scholarly work in this wide-ranging and dynamic historical field, Alex Lichtenstein and I coordinated the conversation. We were mindful of the deeper roots of Black internationalism in earlier phases of Black life and modes of scholarly inquiry, and also mindful of the hard work that organizations like OSWAD and AAIHS and others have done to bring scholars together in the furtherance of knowledge on this complex and multi-layered field. We invited participation from a wonderful group of scholars who represent the field's many different facets, as well as some of its different geographies and periods. Over the course of a few months, we posed a series of questions which these scholars then responded to via email, often engaging with each other in the process. The resulting conversation is provocative, thorough, and an outstanding resource for historians and others who want to understand and teach some of the contours, arguments, and future possibilities of this field of scholarship. And I'd especially like to acknowledge Dr. Keisha Blaine and Dr. Brandon Bird, both of whom were very welcoming to Alex and I when we attended the AAIHS meeting in 2019, and both of whom are also now engaged in editorial work for the American Historical Review in two different capacities. So we are really grateful to their scholarly friendship and cooperation. I'd like to introduce the four panelists now. So I'm going to start with Dr. Monique Badassi, who is an associate professor of history at Washington University in St. Louis, where she teaches courses in African history, Caribbean history, and Africana studies. Broadly, her research interests include the intellectual, political, and social history of decolonization, Pan-Africanism, African diasporic politics, and transnational approaches to history. She is the author of Jah Kingdom, Rastafarians, Tanzania, and Pan-Africanism in the Age of Decolonization, published in 2019. Dr. Carlos Fernandes is a research assistant at the Center of African Studies, or CEA, at Eduardo Mondlane University in Mozambique. His research interests are in the field of sociology of knowledge, intellectual history, and social conditions of knowledge production in Mozambique. Dr. Dennis Laumann is Dunavant University Professor of African History in the Department of History at the University of Memphis, a specialist in the history of West Africa, especially the nation of Ghana, His publications include Colonial Africa, 1884 to 1994, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2019, and Remembering the Germans in Ghana, by Peter Long Publishers in 2018. And I should say the Colonial Africa volume is in its second edition. Dr. Benjamin Talton is an associate professor of history at Temple University, where he teaches courses on the history of modern Africa and the African diaspora. He has also taught at Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. He has published 3 books, his most recent one being In This Land of Plenty, Mickey Leland and Africa in American Politics, which appeared with University of Pennsylvania Press in 2019. He currently serves on the executive board of the Association for the Study of the Worldwide Diaspora, or ASWAD. I'd also just briefly like to mention the other participants in the AHR conversation who are not on the panel today, but whose thoughts you can and should read in the conversation. So Dr. Kim B. Butler, who is Associate Professor of History in the Department of African Studies Africana Studies at Rutgers. Dr. Tejasvi Nagaraja, who is Assistant Professor of History at Cornell University's ILR School. And Dr. Kira Thurman, who is Assistant Professor of History and Germanic Languages and Literatures at the University of Michigan. So I'd like to start today by posing a few questions to the panelists to just kick things off, and each will have a chance to respond briefly. And we'll then shift to taking audience questions after we've been through the 2 or 3 questions that I've kind of given them to think about, and also we'll also try to get the panelists to engage each other as things unfold. So the first question that I wanted to pose is that, so you've had a bit of distance from the conversation's preparation, which mostly took place the first half of 2020, even though the volume came out in December of last year. And so I wanted to have you all think about what stands out to you as its main contribution to historical scholarship from your perspective now. And feel free, anyone, to start. I know everybody's super eager, but.
Shall I be the brave one and jump out so I could claim the title of being brave?
Thank you, Dr.
If only for that reason. Well, thank you, Michelle. I also want to echo your thanks to the AHR, to you in particular, and to the AHR, to Alex Lichtenstein, also to our fellow contributors who aren't here. I see Tej is in the audience, so shout out to Tej. But also Kim Butler, who said she happens to be my neighbor. So I saw her, I spoke to her yesterday. She said she's going to be chiming in, and also to Kira Thurman. So this question of the distance from the conversation and what we've gained from it, I'll first say that, and I wonder if my co-panelists and contributors share this, I entered the conversation with a great deal of trepidation. I found it a bit daunting, actually, because although I've used the term Black internationalism, I very much consider myself a scholar of African studies, a historian of Africa and of the African diaspora. And those are intellectual spaces really where Black internationalism really does not have the same currency as it does in African-American studies, and specifically African-American history. So I felt as if perhaps I was treading into terrain where I did not belong, perhaps. Although I will say in my recent work, I have used Black internationalism. I used it to describe my project on Mickey Leland, African Americans in Congress, and their approaches to the apartheid in South Africa and food crisis in Africa in the 1980s. So I used it, but I always thought of it more as an adjective. So you are Black internationalistic politics or perspective or an outreach. I didn't think of it as a noun, although when I went back, I looked at it and I actually do use the term Black internationalism in that way. So one thing the conversation really did do for me is make me far more cognizant of my use of the word and what it means and what it may not mean and the limits of it. And I will say, as I've come from the conversation, I will not use it in the same way. I don't think it doesn't really work in the same way I thought that it worked for me. And one thing out of the conversation, I think, first of all, we didn't have any Americanists in the conversation. So there really wasn't a debate. We're all coming from this more global, international perspective, not coming out of, although we're based, some of us were based in North America. That wasn't our intellectual orientation. So there wasn't a lot of debate on there. But I just felt that the conversation opened up to me the very limits of the term. And I always thought of it as limited, but I think one thing we also agreed on is that its meanings is rather amorphous. And so where it applies and doesn't apply, and I think I came down on the side to, it doesn't really do the work of describing the intellectual practice, the activism, kind of just really illuminating the historical significance of events and individuals and groups in time and space. So I was just awoken to really the limits of the term. Sadly, I think perhaps we were invited to really animate and invigorate the term, but I'm actually on the verge of really actually abandoning it, which I can go into detail about later on. It just in the context in which I work, I don't think it works. But other things is coming out of the conversation, then I'll pass the mic to others, is that I really appreciated us getting into the importance of context for looking at even terms, the Black that goes in front of Black internationalism. So whether we're in North America or the Caribbean, Blackness, Black mean somewhat different things, and even more so if we get into the Pacific realm. And if we get into South Africa, it means something very different. And in Brazil, of course, we have these various iterations of non-white that come into play. So that was also very important. And then lastly, just for this part of the question, is looking at governance and ways in which governance complicate what we are calling Black internationalism or transnational activism or engagement, and again, in this amorphous sense of it. And when you get into, say, post-65, post-74 in Africa, or even post-1994, that it gets very messy when you have to deal with not just activism on the ground and fighting white supremacy and fighting imperialism or fighting manifestations of capitalism, when you have to deal with diplomacy. There is constraints on possibilities, which I think complicate these types of relationships. But I will say I found the conversation highly informative, rich. I loved the exchange. And it also makes me think we do a deep dive into diaspora when that term gained currency and what it meant, and Black nationalism when that term gained currency and what it meant, and Pan-Africanism. Context matters in that regard as well. So I think if we look at Black internationalism, it's gaining this attention in a particular political moment as well. Are we done?
That was it.
I can continue. Yeah, I felt exactly the same way as Ben when I thank Michelle and Alex for inviting me to be one of the participants in this conversation. And two things that really struck me from our conversation and reading more about Black internationalism is that, number one, our training, our education, our specializations, our field, our politics shape the kind of ways we think about terms like Black internationalism and Pan-Africanism. And I would say instinctively, I think because of my training by what I would call classic Pan-Africanists, my undergraduate and graduate school years, and my working on Ghana and in African history, I instinctively use the term Pan-Africanism in my teaching and my writing as kind of a general term to encompass many different aspects of solidarity across the African world, including Black internationalism. So, that struck me right away that, my background kind of certainly influenced the way I thought about terms like Black internationalism and Pan-Africanism. I was struck by what Monique put in the conversation in reference to Robin Kelly's article, that the arguments he was making were not new to people who came out of Black studies departments, who are educated in Black studies departments. So that's one thing. The other main thing that I got from the conversation is that, we didn't really reach a consensus on what Black internationalism is, and there isn't consensus out there. I think people use the term in different ways. There's more narrow definitions of Black internationalism as something specifically Marxist-Leninist or left, or only encompassing politics on the left. And then people use it more broadly, and sometimes I think inaccurately. I mean, looking at those more narrow definitions, many of the issues we raised in our conversation and the examples we gave were not relevant. If we go with that more narrow, I'm not saying narrow like it being wrong, but more narrow in terms of the way people imagine what Black internationalism is. Almost concurrent with our conversation, Charisse Burden-Selly and Gerald Horn published a chapter in the Rutledge Encyclopedia of Pan-Africanism, in which they give a very specific definition of Black internationalism as a term and as a concept and as a political program, which when I read that, some of the examples we gave and some of the arguments we made certainly don't fall within that definition. Well, there.
Okay, all right. Hello?
Yep, go ahead. Carlos?
Yeah, okay. I'm going to talk now because I'm afraid that my internet will go down. I'm connecting through my cell phone because I'm in rural Mozambique. I'm doing field work in Chakwe district, and the laptop and the connection laptop is not working, so I'm a bit anxious about the connection here, but I hope it goes well. So I had the same feeling as Benjamin was saying, when he said when he entered this year was in a trepidation. I was in the same kind of feeling. I remember when I received the email from Professor Alex. I didn't know him personally, and my first impression was that email was a kind of an hacker email. It kind of, here in Mozambique we call that the Nigerians like to do these send emails that they ask for donations, things like that, and it's like a hacker's thing. And I thought that it was and hackers. I remember staying like 1 week without responding to Alex, and then when I saw all these people, in the list, and I checked and I said, wow, this is interesting scholars. I said, okay, maybe this might be serious. So because actually Black internationalism was not something that I really discussed here in Mozambique. And we saw Black internationalism and Pan-Africanism, as also Dennis was saying, as a general term. And it was more linked to a kind of, political ideological movement. And it was interesting to me to see in these conversations that we took that and we turned that concept, we turned that term into a concept in a kind of epistemic discussions about, the biography of that concept, the multiple genealogies of that specific country. And, as I was going to the conversation, I saw this kind of metamorphosis in that, only in my perception of what Black internationalism was, but also in our discussions that we are, taking that concept seriously and seeing the limitations, heuristic possibilities of the concept. We even discussed, analytical precision. If it's important to have a kind of a precision when you're talking about concepts. But the author said, analytical precision, it's not important in social science. We have to think about other kinds of but the discussion, the hot discussions on the concepts itself, I think it was interesting and discussing critically how the concept was formed and the different contexts where it is applied, different intellectual genealogies of the concept. I think this is I think one of the main contributions. There's to make people aware that, Black internationalism is not just one single narrative. There are multiples Black internationalism. So it's on the plural. It's a plurality actually of Black internationalism. It's not just a single part. Black as one people. The same struggle. There are different struggles. There are different contexts. There are different agendas. There are different conditions of knowledge production that you have to take. And also this idea, and I think Monique also stressed a lot this, to shift the centers where we start Black internationalism, to recenter Black internationalism, and also to give room to the theories from the South and see how the concept of Black internationalism changes when you see it from a different geography of knowledge. I think this, for me, I learn a lot with that kind of discussions. It's kind of epistemic discussions, but at the same time, historical discussions on this concept that seems simple, but it's very complex when you discuss. In the end of the conversations, Danny was saying that that he wasn't sure if Black internationalism was different from Pan-Africanism, and I think it was great that we ended with this kind of doubt, with this kind of inquietations, with this kind of questions. We didn't end with answers. We end with a question like, in the end, what is specific on Black internationalism? Is it different from Pan-Africanism? Is it the same thing? Where is the precision of the concept there? This kind of, and yeah, I will stop from here maybe. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Michelle, to you and to Alex for the invitation to join the conversation. I agree with Carlos and really liked his term about the geographies of knowledge, right? In terms of, the fact that we chose to emphasize multiple sites of origin. But I would say in terms of what stands out, to answer your question, Michelle, as our main contribution to the scholarship, I would say figuring out, or efforts to figure out the differences between Pan-Africanism and Black internationalism. And I started this conversation, but I'm not sure that we pushed it as far as it can go. In terms of the political stakes of choosing Black internationalism over Pan-Africanism. And I insist, right, that Pan-Africanism sort of fell out of vogue in the 90s, and there was a real reason for this. And I'm concerned that many scholars still assume that we can't find nuance within the study of Pan-Africanism. And, as a result of the impact of, works of scholars like Gilroy, those attempts to move away from Africa and the dismissal of Black nationalism or Pan-Africanism as a framework, because it's, perceived to be, outside of, the possibilities of nuance, because we prefer to associate Blackness with sort of diasporic innovation and not African roots. So I think we need to further interrogate what makes Black internationalism so appealing, why it has, why we have this feeling that it has exploded, all right? Well, the term has exploded, I would say. I just don't think the idea of Black people thinking in transnational terms is new. That's what I meant when I said it was not new. It might be new to some Americanists, but it's not new, a new concept. So I would say, raising the issue of the political states and why Black internationalism has become such a popular term has been the most important contribution to the scholarship.
Wonderful, thank you all. So the second question I wanted to have you all respond to is, and you've touched on some of these already, but this would be another opportunity to kind of highlight some specifics. So something that you learned from the conversation as it unfolded, Or to put it another way, how did it cause you to rethink histories of Black internationalism that you thought you knew, or the shape of the field, or its position as an intellectual construct, which is kind of the way that we ended the conversation. So, any takers?
I'll go. So I was reminded of how generative and useful it would be for us to engage each other across conventional linguistic divides. You know, as I was reading the responses of my colleagues, I started to think, you know, if we were not trained in graduate programs, you know, to do either, you know, Francophone or Lusophone or Spanish or English, you know, if we, you know, produce scholarship about Black internationalism across those divides, I think it would make for really generative, important conversations. I think for now, I think that was the thing that struck me the most.
I guess I'll add something brief that, I mean, I sort of addressed this question in the first one, as you mentioned, Michelle, but one of the things that struck me was how North American, how really North American the term Black internationalism is. And I don't mean that to be divisive or to say it's not relevant, but you know, during the conversation when I would talk with colleagues based at African institutions, they were completely unfamiliar with the term Black internationalism. And some even got a bit upset that it was a substitute for Pan-Africanism and, you know, suggested that this is not, you know, this is a kind of I don't know, like weakening of Pan-Africanism as a term and a concept and a politics. So it just reinforced to me that because I'm in North America and I was educated here and I teach here, that, and because, you know, I also try to engage African-American history literature, that I was more familiar with that term Black internationalism than the colleagues I work with in places like Ghana and elsewhere on the continent. So there's a bit of disconnect, I think, between the literature and academics on the continent. I don't know if others agree with that.
To this question of what we learned, and I'm still thinking about it. I guess I'm still, there's so much out of that, but just taking the term seriously and the use of our terms, to go back to what Carlos and Dennis were talking about with Pan-Africanism, I take that ism seriously as a belief system. And that's really what I'm getting at when I'm saying I'm leaving this conversation reluctant to employ the term in my work so much, because I don't want to impose a belief system on people who may not have held it. Because one of the challenges I had in the conversation was to go back and again, take seriously the term and where can we find it rooted in history? And I felt some of the best work done among students and writers in France, particularly Paris in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, who are explicitly using this term, you know, Le Monde Noir or you know, Internationalism Noir, particularly in Présence Africaine, where they see themselves as tied to this broader community of people of African descent around the world, right? And so, but I just, it forced me to think about the extent to which that idea really had legs to go on and carry itself into the future. And through this conversation, thinking about that and seeing that it did not really, and then we get into Pan-Africanism. I want to be very careful. I think we ended the conversation with this, at least this was my point, of not to conflate the two, where you could have Pan-Africanism that is an iteration of Black nationalism or a Black nationalistic thought, as I think I prefer to use it going forward, but not vice versa. Not all Black internationalism is in fact, it does the opposite, is more of a decentering of Africa. And it also puts the onus on race again, which coming out of Africa is relevant, but very different, very different. So the North American context is very important, as Dennis was saying. I wonder how the conversation would have been different if there had been a scholar of the African-American historical experience as part of the conversation. So again, just thinking about the lineage, the genealogy of these terms was very useful to me and really made me want to be more conscious of the terms I'm using when I'm applying them backwards upon people who are not here to defend themselves, except for the writings that we have that have outlived them, right? And so I think if I say, like now, I'm doing some work around some activists in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and who were international, who moved around in activist circles and who visited Africa. But then can I say they're necessarily Black internationalists? Do they believe in an idea of Black internationalism? If they valorize the liberation of Africa, does that make them Pan-Africanists? I would say no, not necessarily. So just because one travels and is politically conscious and has solidarity with the left, we can't then slap on a label to them. I think we have to take the terms seriously and the ideas of the people that we're engaging with seriously. And I in no way mean to suggest that scholars who are dealing in these areas aren't taking them seriously. I'm thinking of my own thought process, my own learning that I'm doing as we grapple with these terms. So again, I think one thing coming out of this conversation is really think about what these folks in the 1920s and 30s in Paris were trying to do, and then what it became, right? So negritude is something that comes out of that, but that's not what they began doing. And what what folks in the late 1800s were doing, Henry Sylvester Williams, Du Bois, and others are doing with Pan-Africanism, then what it becomes. And so I think Black internationalism is also something we could just pay respect to and acknowledge the lineage out of which it comes, out of which it came, and then really how it manifests itself in the current political and cultural moment.
Carlos, would you like to add anything?
I think, yeah, one thing that, another thing that, made this concept of Black internationalism more interesting to discuss and actually more complex to tackle was, I think it was Dennis who brought this, and for me it was a big learning of this idea of the reverse diaspora. I found it interesting to discuss this idea of reverse diaspora in connection with Black internationalism, because it actually disrupts our given ideas, our mainstream, or the mainstream thinking that Black internationalism was a single movement that started from Africa to the Americas, and and all these connections across the Atlantic, for example, and with this idea of the reverse diaspora, Dennis was bringing this this question that what in two concepts that in two definitions that seem so normal to characterize Black internationalism, for example, the continent, as the source, Africa, and the diaspora. This idea, what I think Dennis brought with this idea of the reverse diaspora that I didn't know, and I learned a lot, was that what is continental and what is diasporic when you have, for example, Brazilians who went back to Nigeria, to West Africa, to Benin, with their orishas, Nago, and they influenced actually the African context, and he gave other examples of this kind of, counter dynamics within this idea of the Black internationalism, and actually challenging the mainstream idea of what Black internationalism is, and seeing, of the influence coming from Africa to the other parts. And I was thinking about my own biography in Mozambique, and the question of racial racial minorities in Africa, what it is in Africa, someone who is mixed race, for example, and it's not a black, they don't consider them as black, because if you have like in US, in Africa, if you have a drop of white or other blood, you are not considered a black. And in Mozambique, you have also this kind of Indian, the Indian Ocean dynamics, like Indians in Mozambique, Black Indians in Mozambique. And these ideas actually challenge the concept of Black internationalism. And in Africa, you got Black internationalism. It's not on the curriculum, for example, mostly in universities. Maybe in South Africa, who had the legacy of apartheid, they have a white minority dominance. But in Mozambique, where after independence, it was a Black majority who took over the country, and it was a Black majority who was running the country. The question of race was minimized, but there was this kind of tensions, this kind of diasporic people within Africa that came from other parts of the world that were not considered, for example, Black. And reverse diaspora. I think it was an interesting topic.
Can I just make a quick comment there? If I had to go back, I wouldn't. The question, I think that was in response to a question about what are some of the new directions. And strictly speaking, reverse diaspora literature doesn't fall under Black internationalism, right? I mean, to be more accurately classified as being, Pan-Africanism or African diasporic studies or whatever. And I think that highlights a little bit of the unclarity that I had about the differences in the terms and the fact that, if you go with a more ideologically specific definition of Black internationalism, that literature is not at all relevant, right? So if I had to go back and edit, I'd probably take that out as an example.
So this, if you don't mind, Michelle, I'm sorry, because Carlos and Dennis's point made me think of this. Then, and I haven't read Charisse's and Gerald Horne's piece. I'm eager to read it. I'm sure. I think I assume part of what they're doing is really pushing the conversation forward by coming up with a more discrete and clear definition of Black internationalism, which I would welcome. But in rereading the conversation, which I did last night, and then listening to Carlos's point, and Dennis, your point as well, and also just to highlight my friend's work, Monique Badassi, who happens to be here with us, thinking about reverse diaspora and thinking about what Walter Rodney was doing, and what the Rastas that Monique, you write about, are doing when they are imagining an Africa and then really activate those aspirations by attempting to, and in some instances, returning in quotes, Africa, to Tanzania, and then in other instances, Shashamani in Ethiopia. That's a form of Pan-Africanism, right? The sense of the global Black community centered around Africa and their connections to it is by virtue of their history and their lineage. And I was struggling to think of, does then Black internationalism really fit in the African historical context? Is it a term that would find place outside of, because where does Frantz Fanon in Algeria fit into the conversation around Black internationalism? Perhaps it does. Or we think of the Panthers, some Panthers going to Algeria or having common cause with movements in Southern Africa. Perhaps those fit. So when we have North American actors or Anglophone European actors in the continent or in the Caribbean, then that fits. But outside of that engagement with the global North, perhaps, and I'm not saying it does not, but perhaps it only fits in that way. It's a question. So so maybe my attempt to abandon it is perhaps premature, but we have to be specific in terms of geography.
May I, Michelle? Yeah, in response to that, Ben. So my quest for precision, I think, was precipitated by what I saw as this kind of maybe lazy approach to it where people would be trying to trace like a history of Black internationalism from slavery to the 20th century or something, right? And use the term. And we cannot possibly collapse all of those periods, you know, into just sort of one kind of flat analytical term like Black internationalism. So I think, you know, it's important for us to define it in our own work. What are we referring to specifically? Why are we calling it that? But to your question, Ben, I think, I agree. I think, so I use the word Pan-Africanism in the title of my book, right? But I do think the period of decolonization and the post-independence period, I think we can use Black internationalism because I'm thinking of the rise of nation states and the way that people are engaging the international within that context. Also the way that somebody like Nyerere would engage Michael Manley or Castro, who are not phenotypically Black, but are engaged with a sort of political definition of Blackness, using it, embracing it, and are embraced by phenotypically Black people as Black because of a political orientation. And then, of course, in that period, Walter Rodney also famously includes Indians, as in South Asians, in his definition of Black within the context of a Caribbean Black power, right? So I think in that sense, we can use Pan-Africanism and Black internationalism within the same study, as I think I do, because we're talking about a kind of grassroots, I would say Rastafari is doing Pan-Africanism in terms of the repatriation, as you said, Ben. But it's happening within the context of continental Africans and diasporic Africans actually engaging in a Black internationalist type of politics made possible by the rise of Black nation states. So I would say beyond even a sort of North American, the North American sort of understanding of Black internationalism that you referred to, maybe that's one way to think about the differences, say, between the interwar years and the sort of post-World War II moving into decolonization type years. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right. So I think we're at 2:45, and I want to make sure that there's plenty of time for Q&A and audience engagement. I did want to also just make a point that it is true that most of the scholars who participated in the conversation are not scholars of North America, but Tej's work actually is primarily engaged with U.S. history. So I wanted to just highlight that, and maybe Tej is here, so he may want to speak for himself at some point. So let's see, we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A. So maybe I'll just start with one from Alex, the editor of the AHR, who, let me scroll back up, who directs this at Carlos. He says, I never got a chance to ask you this during the formal discussion. Could you speak a bit about the legacy of Ruth First and Aquina de Braganza and how the CAS carries that on in post-colonial Southern Africa?
Okay. Should I start?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Ruth First was a South African scholar and activist, right? And he was the scientific director of the Center of African Studies in Mozambique. And Aquino de Braganza was the director. And Aquino actually was an Indian guy who came to Mozambique. No, came to Morocco during the liberation struggles in Lusophone Africa. He was based in Morocco and then Algeria, linked with all these Lusophone scholars and intellectuals fighting against Portuguese colonialism. And it was there that he met Samora Machel, and Samora Machel invited him to come to Mozambique. So and gave him a ministry position, and it said, no, I want to work on social science and something like that. And then he founded the center that. And I think these two people were interesting scholars in terms of making that center a cosmopolitan and international place in terms of knowledge production at that time in Mozambique. After the disenchantment of Nyerere's socialist utopia in Tanzania, most of these left-wing scholars, they left Dar es Salaam University, they left Tanzania in general, and then they went to Mozambique and seeing, as a new laboratory of this kind of utopia building in terms of socialism. And these two guys, I think they produce, a context in Mozambique, intellectual context, that were prolific in terms of social science production. They brought social science from not just these people who came from Dar es Salaam University, but from all over the world, and they were key in terms of seeing, Mozambique in the context of Southern Africa, and and also at that kind of moment, also shifting, the hegemony of South African history to the region. And they were saying, you cannot discuss, you cannot analyze any country in the Southern Africa region without this kind of regional conscience, that, all these countries are interlinked. They have entangled histories. They are not just national histories they are playing, but they are entangled histories. And they all are part of one single block. And one of the things that, in their theoretical framework that united all these countries was this kind of, idea of the South African empire, the apartheid regime trying to create a hegemonic bloc in the region, not just an economic build an economic hegemony, but also build a military hegemony. But this hegemony also implied dominance, implied coercion, implied aggression. It wasn't just a pure hegemony in terms of consensus, in terms of cooptation, but there was moments that consensus and cooptation and dialogue was not possible, and coercion came in terms of the stabilization war and all these things. But I think one of the points of these two scholars was the main point was to bring this idea of entangled histories of the region, of transnational perspective, and that moment I think they were dealing with the idea of Pan-Africanism in a certain way, trying to unite all these countries in the same fight against colonialism, against white minority rule, against oppression, and also Pan-Africanism linked with ideas with Marxist ideas, anti-capitalism, against imperialism. So there were all these connections. We can talk about Black internationalism in terms of a war against racial oppression, because they said, we are part of the same region, and we're gonna fight against racial oppression. But you also have there, a war against economic destabilization, a war against, the civil war that was in Mozambique, and they all connect in that sense. Yeah.
Thank you, Carlos, and thanks for the question, Alex. We also have a comment / question from Nemata Blyden, who writes, I'm wondering also if this may be a generational thing. Younger scholars seem to embrace Black internationalism, and it may have to do with its use largely in the US, where Black signifies something very different. Also curious about thoughts on geographic and perhaps field-specific uses. So we talk about negritude, Pan-Africanism, and Black internationalism within specific contexts, perhaps sometimes interchangeably, with a question mark at the end. Any reflections on that?
This is the sound of us thinking.
She also adds in a second question, and what then is the term that would be used in the Latin American African context? So in case that helps to.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question.
I mean, I would just add that what I alluded to before. I mean, in African history, you know, I'm sure the other panelists will agree that Black internationalism isn't a term that one comes across. You know, and Pan-Africanism certainly is something that, you know, is used in many different ways, encompassing many different ideological, you know, orientations and movements and eras. And so, you know, to me, as somebody in African history, I think of the term Black internationalism as a term and a concept that's developed amongst North American scholars, particularly those working in African American history.
I'll jump in. I mean, I do agree that it's generational, but I think it's, you know, tied to the politics I mentioned earlier. I think it's generational because our younger scholars now are more heavily influenced by a generation that moved away from the approaches of our stalwarts of the Black intellectual tradition. So the works that, you know, saw Black people in transnational or international terms or were preoccupied with Pan-Africanism came from people, you know, 60s, 70s, very influenced by a Black studies tradition. And I think that we moved away from that to the point that, you know, many of the newer works that are repackaged and not new, we have to remind people that they're repackaged and not new. And instead of, you know, consciously building on those works, I think we went through a period when those works were marginalized and associated with a more sort of radical Black nationalism of a bygone era, sort of, you know, thrown away along with Afrocentricity. And so I think the newer generation, you know, is a product of that move away from our sort of Black studies roots, where I think the, you know, much of this work is rooted. So I think that's the main issue, that we can't get away from the politics of it, and it being in large measure a deliberate, you know, move.
Okay, if neither Ben or Carlos have anything to add there, we have another question. This one is for Carlos again. So it says, on your discussion of social science as imperialism and social science in Mozambique in the published article, Dr. Martin Luther King in 1967 presentation to American Psychological Association had high hopes for social science. I'm trying to discover if he was wrong, and in your opinion, how is social science seen? And then she says, I'm going to read your suggestions. This was from Sophie Kurtzopoulos. Carlos, do you have a response?
The question is how social science is seen today in Mozambique?
Yes, I think so. In your opinion, how is social science seen? I think, yes.
Okay, briefly, I think this is also connected with Alex's questions on the legacy of Root First. And, you know, we have two periods in Mozambique that, you know, the socialist period with its kind of utopia of, you know, building, you know, building, you know, this kind of communal solidarity, building collective work, intellectual collective work too, you know, intellectual production without an author, for example, most of the publication done at that period in Mozambique through the Center of African Studies didn't have an author. It was like a collective author, the center. And this was linked to these ideas of, that it was a bourgeois thing to publish with your name, to build up your career, your individual career. It was something to fight against. There was this all idea of collective work. The scientists will work as an artisan works, collectively, like a peasant works in a communal. But I think after the end of the 90s, all these values were seen as an hindrance in Mozambique. Mozambique, suddenly was into a neoliberal economy. Was the norm. You have to publish yourself. You have to go and look for consultancy work because there was no funding, state funding, or even international funding with all these left-wing organizations like CIDASAREC in Sweden to support research in Mozambique. So everyone was doing their own work, and social science and that kind of thing was turning to more to applied, like applied social science, and very much shaped by the designs and the interest of the donors, external donors, and consultancy work. So it's a kind of social science that is much ripped, ripped off of the theoretical substance in terms of but and more in terms of the terms of reference of what a specific organization wants you to do. So basic research at university, it's kind of in crisis. Not just I'm not just talking about laboratories, the research that's done in laboratories and all those kind, but even in social science and humanities, it's all the scholars at university are now busy trying to find consultancy work, because they think if you are trying to publish, it's no sense. But they say, what are you doing? You're trying to write an article to publish in a peer review and spending all this time without getting any money, while you can do a lot of consultancy work and get some dollars and houses. So social science and also the critical side of the social science also, it's kind of silence in this kind of world of development and NGOs and applied research. So there's no critical social science. There's no science that is looking critically to governance, to this kind of thing. It's a very small. There are only like one institution that is doing that kind of work. But why? Because they get a lot of funding from European governments, that give money and say, okay, we're gonna give you money to do your own research and to set up your own agenda. But this is a rarity in Mozambique. It's only 2 organizations that are doing that, and at the same time they are preserving a kind of social science that is actually, typical from what we want a university to do. Critical social science. They are doing, a kind of basic research. But the trend, it's consultancy work in Mozambique. That's And I think the critical social science that Mozambique is doing now, it's also a legacy from Ruth First and Aquino de Bragança, because we have this kind of role models in terms of how critical they were, how quality research they produce, qualitative research they produce, and okay, yeah, there is this kind of legacy there, but yeah, it's being threatened by this the world of NGOs and applied social science. Yeah.
Thank you, Carlos. So we have a question from Kwasi Densu. How can we understand the choice by activist scholars to distinguish between Pan-Africanism and Black internationalism through the failures and successes of the Tricontinental Conference, i.e. the argument that Ann Mahler makes that noted Afro-Cuban activist and scholar Walterio Carbonell's efforts and ideas were supported to advance Black internationalism abroad, but subverted Black self-determination at home for Afro-Cuban communities?
Okay, so I'll jump in. So that's a really good question, Kwesi. I think of that. I think of that in terms of just the role of the state, the rise of the post-colonial nation state, and the fact that it's not just Cuba, obviously. It is a really common story, the way that activists and particularly Black nationalists were marginalized by, quite often by Black state actors, right? I think that somewhere like Cuba has received greater scrutiny because people are, trying to undermine the validity of a socialist state, or they're thinking through socialism and communism, and they're, eager to point out sorts of contradictions. But I see that as a major contradiction, based on the roles that states played after independence, in trying to not only, control, as they saw it, control what was happening within their borders, to maintain peace, right? But also to assert state power. And I think that that's a common story. We can see it in Jamaica in terms of Rastafarians and other, Black power advocates being marginalized, but celebrated abroad, or the perception of a very radical, place. But that has never been the full story, with the Jamaican state, constantly penalizing Black nationalists and their, activism. So I would say, I think of it in sort of that, in terms of that context, where activists are typically perceived to be or see themselves as Pan-Africanists, and the kind of Black internationalist state, or Black internationalism that sort of depends or is tied to state action, using that, sometimes appropriating that Black nationalism and connecting with other states as a result, as a contradiction that is, is quite common. So I don't really think of it in terms of how we separate the terms in scholarship, but I see it as rooted in the contradictions of that particular period and what happens with the rise of the Black nation state.
I agree with what Monique said fully, and I would, just add a couple things that, like Monique said, I mean, the Cuban state's attitude towards Black intellectuals and Black organizations and Black culture and Black religions was not unique in the Latin American context at all in the 1960s. Brazil obviously is another case where, there was suppression of Black culture and organizations and intellectuals. But I think, on a politically speaking, I think one of the strengths of the Cuban Revolution has been its ability to withstand self-critiques and to acknowledge failures and mistakes and to attempt to address those. And that's exactly what happened in Cuba in the 90s. And since that, there's been a more public debate about the Cuban state's attitude towards Black intellectuals and cultures and institutions in the 60s, and an acknowledgement of its failures, and an attempt to address those. I mean, that's something, for example, that doesn't happen in the United States of America.
All right. A question from Jacqueline Bethel Muguay. Thank you to all the panelists for debating complicating ideas about Black internationalism. As an Africanist, the term seems to allow for a wider viewpoint of relationships between African-born and non-white individuals beyond African diasporic individuals during decolonization and beyond. So maybe not a question, but a comment.
I would agree with that, though. I think if we identify one of its many useful applications, it is, and it's just part of a history, right? Where people of African descent and in Africa are constantly looking for these nodes of connectivity and applying terminology to it. I think Black internationalism is one of them. If we limit it to the African continent, you are limiting it to this connection to the African continent. There are other nodes of engagement between people of African descent. So I think in that regard, it is useful. I was also thinking about if someone else wants to chime in on that point, but also just going back to what Dennis and Monique were just talking about with regard to Cuba and sovereignty, kind of the precarity of sovereignty. And one thing we didn't really get into, again, is something I'm interested in because I keep talking about governance, but just the global forces that are at work undermining these efforts of Black connections globally and Black efforts for self-determination and Black efforts to create true equality even within their sovereign states. Just the economic forces that are constantly undermining that even to this day. The political forces. This is not in the best interest of the capitalist regimes of the world to have a truly self-determined and connected Black world. And I think that's why there are these constant efforts to form these connections and alliances. But I just think about the ways in which leaders have used a sense of Pan-Africanism or global Blackness and common cause for leverage and legitimacy, but then how that dissipates once they come into power. Again, there are other forces at work, but also internally, where you have these compromised elites. I think famously of the ANC right now. We could think of the MPLA. We can go on in the ways in which Sankara's revolution was undermined in late 1980s. Not to say that they did not have, there weren't limits to their own leadership, right? So we could really do an analysis and for a prognosis of what really goes on. But just the forces at work to undermine a sense of common cause and global Blackness and truly self-determined Black community, even locally, even here in the United States, even where I'm sitting here in Brooklyn, New York, efforts of Black people to be self-determined are constantly being undermined to form common cause. Even where I live now, they say, well, there are divisions between African Americans and West Indians. No, they're not really. They're not. But when you say that there are, then people begin to interrogate, okay, why are there divisions between African Americans and West Indians? It's just not the case. Anyway, the point is that this global context is very, very important, I think, for this conversation of why there is this effort to form common cause, but also why it often falls short and constantly has to be reinvented, recharged, and reanimated.
And that reminds me, Ben, of a point that I think we both made in the conversation, that we need to, if we're going to continue to do the work of Black internationalism, we know not you, Ben, but the rest of us.
Black internationalist.
We're going to continue to use the term, is that we need to stop assuming that all of those histories, that the point of departure is Black radicalism. That we have a history of Black people globally participating in those forces that Ben just mentioned. And we need to also think through those histories.
I think that's how we ended the piece, right? We're talking about other forms of connection. They're not all radical, right, Monique? And many people who think they're about the business of self-determination are supporting UNITA in Angola, thinking that anti-communism is what's best for Africa, or supporting, well, Dennis, you could, did you want to?
Would that be Black internationalism or Black nationalism?
And therein lies the question, right?
I mean, there's a question of, to me, there's like these three strands. There's one, scholars who use the term Black internationalism, which often are not include scholars who are not in the Marxist tradition or on the left. Then there's scholars who employ the term with that specifically Marxist-Leninist context, like Bernstelli and Horn. And then there's also the historic individuals who've articulated that term, who use that term, who tend to be on the left, right? I mean, the Caribbean and in France and beyond. So to me, I mean, I even though I'm on the Pan-Africanist side in terms of terminology, I tend to support those Marxist-Leninist or Marxist or left scholars who think the term should apply specifically to left individuals and organizations and histories. But it's not for me to decide. Right? I'll defer to my colleagues on those issues.
Yeah, I mean, what does it look like when you bring in soldiers, missionaries, you know, people who are operating in those sort of occupying those categories that could go either way, right? I mean, I think soldier radicalism is a thing, but it only works under certain circumstances. And, you know, there are missionaries who are more left than others, who are operating in circles that one could describe, if you were loosely using the term Black internationalism, as being in the mix somehow. And I think this was one of the points I think we considered pursuing in the conversation, like trying to write more specifically about, I think, Ben, you raised the issue of Black conservatism and this whole kind of complex of folks who are not on the left. Anyway, I too would find this really a fruitful, I think, direction to pursue in the future for folks who are looking for ways in. It seems like an area in need of more.
And also, who do we necessarily want to, like, I think of Paul Robeson as very much someone who was a Pan-Africanist, but would definitely fit the way that folks often categorize Black internationalism fits. But he also had common cause with other movements and individuals on the left. He wasn't just confined to race-centered alliances. That's not to say that he wasn't a Black internationalist, as I would use the term, right, with the ist as opposed to the ism. But by putting that label on him, I fear that we erase other politics that he was a part of. Right. So I think just being very conscious of that when we use the term. How are we silencing other aspects of their politics?
But I think it also depends on how we define conservative in a particular historical moment, right? If we're moving beyond, say, the interwar years, and we're thinking of people engaging in more expansive ways. So if we're not going to rigidly separate Marxists from cultural nationalists in the post-independence period, for example, then what does it mean to be, you know, anti-capitalist, but also conservative Christian? It's like when religion comes into it, then it also, you know, demands that we be more sort of open and flexible. So I think unless we're going to limit Black internationalism to just one period, then I think we have the room to find what you were calling sort of conservative Black alliances across national borders, Ben, in your comment.
Or perhaps not even alliances, but I mean, there are these interesting figures like George Washington Williams, who, you know, leaves the US context and embroils himself in kind of missionary opposition to atrocities in Congo. Like, so there are those kinds of folks moving around in the period that I'm interested in, of course.
Or even Alexander Crummell in Liberia, or the first half of Edward Blyden's engagement with Africa. Of course, later on, he embraces more of what we would identify with a Pan-Africanism and valorizing Islam and African culture. Or even if we go to Nigeria, Jai Crowther. So these are all people within the pantheon of Pan-Africanism and African nationalism, and maybe even Black internationalism. But if they step foot in 2021, we would call them very conservative people, extremely conservative. So that, again, context matters, time and place matters.
All right. I think, okay, we have one more question here. Bright Jumpy asks, thanks everyone for a great discussion, and says, is there a relationship between Black internationalism and Afrocentric movements? Are they different, similar, etc.?
Is there a question between Black internationalism and Afrocentric movements? Afrocentricity is another one of these terms that has took on a different meaning in the 1990s. And I think it's also, maybe I'm wrong or overstating it, I think we're seeing a lessening of the use of African-centered because it's often conflated with Afrocentric. I would say, just taking a stab at it, the relationship is the extent to which both of the scholars and the activists behind who push both terms aspire for both to have discrete meanings. So Afrocentric is not just someone who valorizes Africa or has an affinity toward Africa. It's a particular political ideological category, to be Afrocentric, and it's a project. So Afrocentric scholarship is engaged in a certain project, vis-a-vis Eurocentric scholarship, and particularly within history. So you can't just center African people and call yourself an Afrocentrist. That doesn't work. And I can say that with confidence because I'm at Temple University, which is one of the citadels of Afrocentricity. So what I would say is perhaps, and this is just me musing on the topic, that Black internationalism and those who really push for its use, who center it, aspire not to have a similar meaning, but a similar project where you are engaged in something very specific when you focus on actors that are Black internationalists. I don't think the methodology is the same. Like Afrocentricity has a methodology. Black internationalism doesn't have a methodology, but I think it's similarly about pushing against the paradigm of white supremacy. So you privilege these people who are engaged in that work. Claudia Jones looms large, right, in Black internationalism. And we can go on, there's a myriad individuals we can draw to. So I would say to the extent that they're both geared toward undermining white supremacist histories and have discrete meanings related to Black people, there are some similarities, but I would say that that's probably where the connections end. Afrocentricity is something, it's something in and of itself, but also to a particular time period as well, right? So if you look at the rise of Afrocentric scholarship, we think of the 1980s and 1990s, a particular political moment within the Black community as well. Also, both are centered in, obviously, scholars in North America. There's another ways in which they're both similar. There are some Afrocentric scholars that are continental Africans or based in Africa, but the majority are in, or particularly were in, North American institutions and communities. So that's just, yeah, my thoughts coming off the cuff.
I agree. I agree, Ben. I would just add that for many people who do or use the term Black internationalism, Africa has no role at all. That it's sort of optional for people who do Black internationalism. They think it's optional. And many are actually keen on separating definitions of Blackness from Africa. Whereas Afrocentricity is about several things, but about center, as in African centered, about epistemology in terms of what it means to destabilize Eurocentricity. And I think, though it may be problematic in some ways, the emphasis on Egypt, etc., that at least Africa is central to Afrocentricity. Black internationalism, I think Africa should be a part of Black internationalism, but I do understand that it doesn't have to be for many people. My only problem is when it's dismissed for certain political reasons.
In that regard, we could see similarities more with Black Atlantic
Right.
scholarship
Right.
in the late 80s when Gilroy came out in 1993 with the Black Atlantic.
Right, and I would say that Gilroy was a pushback against Afrocentricity, but I think we overcorrected, right? So,
Yes.
and then the impact on the scholarship, Gilroy's impact has been, I mean, I don't even think people think about Africa as a part of modernity. And so they reify those stereotypes about Africa, being pre-modern, backward, outside of the purview of history. So I don't even think when people think Black, for much of the scholarship, it might not even be conscious. They just assume if you're doing the modern world, you're not doing Africa.
And I think also the Afrocentricity in this kind of Eurocentric in reverse logic, they if it's connected to Black internationalism, maybe on the idea that they also put the emphasis on the Black race, a kind of pure race that Africa is for the Black people, and Black people is the people indigenous from Africa, and in that sense, it might be related to Black internationalism in terms of if race is there, it's that if it's Afrocentricity as this idea that it's the Black people and not like mixed people or North African people. It's the Egyptians were Black people, with Black complexion. I don't know.
I would just a point that Ben made there. Maybe think about just as you made the point that Afrocentricity is sort of a North American kind of term or feel like Black internationalism, and that's certainly the case from the 80s and 90s on. But just like Black internationalism might be more embraced by North American scholars today, and it has roots earlier on in the Caribbean. Afrocentricity has roots in the continent, right? Cheikh Anta Diop and other Afrocentric Black negritude, things like that, right? So we could, just like we're having this conversation about Black internationalism, we can have one about Afrocentricity, talking about its meaning and its usage and its lineage and all that.
Yeah, even some of the earliest histories of Black people written by Africans begin in Egypt. But they're engaged in that same debate about the legitimacy of African history. So that's why you have to compare apples and apples. And so there's this Eurocentrism that's going on as well. No, but those are good points, Dennis.
All right, we are down to the last few minutes. So I guess I will just double check to see if any of the audience members have any last questions. Not seeing anything. So maybe we could just do a lightning round of last remarks. So I'll return to the questions I sent earlier and ask, what would be the thing that you would like to see happen next in this field, however you define it? I mean, whether that's new directions in scholarship or, further work on being precise about terms. Floor is open.
I'll say, first of all, thank you, Michelle, for hosting this and engaging us in this conversation, which I think is very fruitful. But just in terms of what I would like to see go, I think I like the direction that it is going. Again, I haven't read Charisse and Gerald Horn's piece, but knowing what they're about, I'm sure it'll be very valuable to really concretize this term, to really, because that's what we spent most of our time on in our AHR conversation about this, the looseness of this use and the looseness of the definition. So I think that'll be very, very useful. And then we could imagine, as Monique says, engagement across South-South relations, and to see the extent to which it actually fits what they are constructing as Black internationalists. So I think those who are using the term should be at the forefront of defining it. those of us here, I certainly, I think, have the liberty to engage those constructions and the extent to which we find them useful, because they are about Black people. But I think it also, an underlying theme for us is really revisiting Pan-Africanism, because we're constantly referring back to it. And I think also, if we look at what's going on with the African Union, with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and what's may or may not happen with that, if we look at the rise of cobalt mining and the importance of battery-powered cars with lithium-ion batteries, and 70% of cobalt is on the continent of Africa. Africa is the center of vehicle production, right? Without Africa, we could say that about other industries as well. And I think there are, we see the rise of these mass movements. We see what happened in Mali. We saw what happened in Burkina Faso, with these people-centered revolutions that are really undermining these authoritarian regimes. Pockets of that in South Africa. We could take a good note from what's going on in India, where the farmers are really shutting down the country and attacking capitalism where capital resides. So I think looking at what's going on in Africa and the future of Africa, of course, I believe the future is Africa. Pan-Africanism was worth coming back to among scholars. I think capitalists, industrialists are looking at Africa. I think scholars need to take a look, not to say they're not, but we need to take a collective look at connections across the continent. And then what happened to this engagement from the diaspora? What happened to Manley trying to leverage his international standing by turning to Africa, or African-American politicians leveraging their power within the halls of power in the United States by turning to Southern Africa in particular. And even Obasanjo, when he first was head of state in the 1970s, asserting himself as a Pan-Africanist, right? So I refuse to believe that it's only a thing of the past. So I think that's worth exploring. Inspired by our conversation on Black internationalism, we need to bring this Pan-Africanism back to the intellectual fore.
Thanks, Ben.
I agree, and I would add, I would say I'm happy to see in more recent scholarship that women are at the center of Black internationalism that people are exploring, and I think it will be good to see more of that. But I completely agree with Ben's comments to close.
Carlos?
Okay, yeah, well, that one is difficult. But I think, and this was, I think, Monique mentioned on the conversations about recentering Black internationalism and seeing different intellectual genealogies and taking attention also, for example, to the theories of the South. And maybe that's one point. It's to see Black internationalism taking as a starting point, for example, a country like Mozambique. Although I think it's a concept that it's not very much used in Mozambique, because Black internationalists put the emphasis maybe superficially, and when you see the concept, like the metaphor that it brings the emphasis on the race, and not like we were used to speeches from Samora talking about Pan-Africanism and all these things. But today, with all this, with capitalism going on, with the multinationals in Mozambique, and we have this idea that a country from the South, like Brazil, it's becoming a kind of empire in Mozambique. Mozambique seen as the South of the South, and Brazil seen as a country from the South, but being in Mozambique and behaving like a capitalist that Samora Machel was against in the 80s. The expropriation of the land, natural resources, and the people there seeing these Brazilians. And when they see a Brazilian guy, they see a white guy. Although in Brazil, he's not considered a white, or in Europe or in US, will not be considered a white, but in Mozambique, it's a white. And, this is it's very complex and brings not just Pan-Africanism, but also these ideas of Black internationalism. When you have, people coming from other countries, you know, from these big international organizations, multinational, going there, you know, work, you know, extracting gas, coal, and all these things, and dealing with the people and the violence that it brings in terms of expropriation of lands and you know, and putting aside people from lands that are not that you know, are not good to harvest and all these kind of things. And you know, yeah, it's research on that kind of topics might be interesting, and even to see how the local populations see this kind of international corporations, you know, like Val do Rio Doce and Exxon, like American Exxon, how they see this kind of connections with the government, the politician, and how they, you know, extracting the lands and taking the natural resources. You know, the question of race is there. I know it's there, but it's also questions of capital. And it's a new thing in Mozambique, you know, with all this discovering of gas and all these things. It's a new thing, and all these connections with capitalism brings new questions that might be interesting to even to try to read it through the lenses of Black internationalism, which was not usual. It will be some original way of seeing the things. Maybe it can bring us new answers, you know, to these old problems that we had. Yeah.
Thank you, Carlos. Dennis?
Well, I know we're out of time, so I'm going to make it short. I agree with all the above mentioned comments and suggestions, and I put in the chat a upcoming Ghana Studies Association panel on the topic of Black internationalism, featuring for graduate students working in Ghanaian history. So I encourage everybody to attend that and to support those graduate students in their work. Thank you very much, Michelle.
Thank you all. This was great.
And also there is one thing that is maybe it's marginal in all of this, but while the conversation was developing and, you know, we were exchanging these emails, you know, I had this feeling of a kind of friendship that was building. Maybe it's illusion, it's like illusionary because we are in different countries, we never met. But as we were exchanging emails like friends, like good friends, we developed this kind of inquisition and kind of interaction and exchanges of ideas that I think it's also a new way of thinking about, you know, in terms of building this kind of friendship. And this reminds me of David Scott, you know, when he talks about friendship as an alternative model of thinking, you know, one that is dialogical and collaborative, and you know, and we, instead of working in the direction of the truth, you know, finding the truth. Although we also talk about precision, but you know, there is always this ideas. I want the other to, because I know that he's listening. Okay, reading, listening, but you know, the idea of clarifying, and this is also an idea from David Scott, you know, that, you know, instead of going to the direction of truth, going to the direction of clarification, you know, and clarifying mutual concerns. And we are dealing with Black internationalism, you know, yeah, maybe this invitation of David Scott to bring friendship, you know, reflection in collaboration through friendship and building a new way of thinking, you know, might be also an interesting way of, you know, yeah.
Thank you, Carlos. And I think that's a great way to wrap things up. And I will just say that it was actually a delight to work with you all on this. And I do consider you all my friends and my colleagues. So this was lovely. Thank you. And yeah, hope to cross paths somewhere face to face sometime soon.
Thank you,
Take
Michelle.
care all.
Thanks to Alex.
Debbie, did you need to come back on?
I'll just say, One last note that a recording of this webinar will be available on the AHA's YouTube channel shortly. And another thank you to our sponsors, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Stanton Foundation, the History Channel, and Oxford University Press. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions, and a special thanks to our panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you.